What's up, folks? Welcome to another edition of Comic Talk. I'm Ryan Murphy, and I'm very pleased and blessed to be here today with the one and only Mr. Dan DiDio, formerly of DC Comics, now of Mad Cave Studios, and Frank Miller Presents. And
Yeah.
a wonderful figure in comics history. An absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for being here, Mr. DiDio.
Well, thanks for having me, Ryan. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I usually do with these things, I just sort of kind of go over a lot of like ground. Obviously, as I was telling you before the interview, there's certainly a period that I personally, from like a journalistic perspective, have always wanted to get behind the scenes of, and we'll get to that. But why don't we start with, because I think you have been writing professionally since 1989, like you were in your early 20s, it seems. This is all from Wikipedia.
Actually, I've been writing in the 80s, but thank you for meeting me in my 20s in the 80s. I was more like closer to my 30s in the 80s. I'm getting closer to that. But yeah, for me personally, I've always had an interest in writing. I used to submit material as well. I've got rejection letters from Marvel and DC dating back to 1978, which is kind of fun for me. I keep them in a little, like nice little folder and all that, just because, it reminds you of what you wanted to do and what your interests were. But I did some writing in the early days. When I was working at ABC, I still had a lot of interest in comics. So through Jimmy Palmiotti, who's a longtime friend of mine, but also was a neighbor of mine in Brooklyn, I met a number of people in the comic industry, and I started to do things on the sidelines. Did some writing for Wizard magazine, did some writing for Dynamic Forces, a couple other people along the way, and I found that to be a lot of fun and enjoying. But my primary business was TV and television, and I really didn't get involved in comics full time until 2002.
Yeah. So what brought you to DC Comics at that point in your life?
Um, well, I was at a juncture. I've been working in TV for almost 20 years. I was working for an animation company called Mainframe out of Vancouver. I was doing a lot of flying. I was on a plane 3 weeks out of the month, which was exhausting. And I was looking to make a little bit of a change. And through a mutual friend, I met Paul Levitz. And Paul was looking for somebody with a comic book knowledge, which I had, but outside experience, which I also had. And I was looking to get back on the East Coast, which is where I was living. And because my company I was working for was based on the West Coast, reason why I was on the plane. So I was looking to basically resettle and get back to New York and get back working over there, and honestly be able to work in a business that I enjoyed, which was comics. So it was a nice fit at the right moment.
And let me see here real quick. I'm consulting some of my notes, but you started in 2002, and pretty soon after that, it was 2004. You were made executive editor, which is essentially editor in chief for all intents and purposes. And in that time that you were there, there's this thing. I sent you some of my thoughts on this, but I call it like the age of putting things back, putting the toys back in the box. Sort of started in that era. I think the very first inklings of that, when you were still an editor, I think you were an editor on the Superman titles, and one of those titles that had started right around that time was Superman Batman by Jeff Loeb. And the very first thing he did, because obviously like the 80s, this goes take us back to the 80s real quick. The crisis had reset so much and rewritten so much of DC continuity. It left it such a mess. And one of the things they did was to turn Lex Luthor into this, corrupt businessman instead of a mad scientist who wore this suit. And right away, and then he became president of the United States. And right away, when Jeff Loeb took over that title in 2003 or so, he made it clear, like in Wizard magazine, like we're going to bring him back to like the status quo. And was that anything that you had discussions? Was that all Jeff's ideas to sort of, that's like starting?
It was a lot of what we were trying to do. I mean, where I was I wasn't the editor of Superman at the time. I was basically executive editor while that was taking place. The two things that happened: we had the Batman Hush series kickoff with Jeff and Jim Lee, and that really played a lot of the iconic beats of Batman storytelling, and really brought it back in a position where you remembered what all the key things were that really made Batman's lore work so well. And I always loved the way they assembled that book, because every issue focused on another character that really filled out Batman's life. And you really got a good sense of who he was just when you read across it and see how he interacts with all the various characters in that Batman universe. So when Jeff wanted to do Superman Batman, it really was that sense of epic adventure we wanted to do, as well as playing upon a lot of the themes and ideas that people recognize the most. And that was a lot of my pitch was I always wanted to get back to things that was the most recognizable aspects of the characters. That's why we went after Hal Jordan in Green Lantern and making Hal Jordan a Green Lantern rather than making him a Spectre. Nobody knew he was the Spectre. He was wearing a mask as the Spectre. So we wanted
Mhm.
to bring him back to the lore. And Jeff was really the person who had a very clear vision on Green Lantern and really knew what he wanted to do. So it's just about pushing that forward, getting the Titans back to a team that made sense that people could react to. Get back to that. And Superman was another one of those. Jeff Loeb had been writing Superman before I got there. And then I believe he either came off the book when he moved to Superman Batman or he moved on to another project. But the bottom line is that he had a very clear cinematic sense to the story arcs that he wanted to tell, working with different artists that really played to the strength of the artist, and really playing with a lot of the aspects that people reckon was most recognizable who the characters were. I mean, in particular, I think if I'm not mistaken, in that particular arc, they brought back the Lex Luthor battle suit that Marv Wolfman had created back in the 80s. And I think a lot of people reacted extraordinarily well to that because they recognized it not just from the comics, but also from toys and maybe some animation as well. So it played out really nicely and really capitalized on what people remember those characters to be, and we built out from there.
Yeah, and then of course the second arc was bringing back Supergirl. So again, neither of these things are rewriting continuity. They're not going back to the continuity of pre-crisis, but they are bringing back certain status quos from pre-crisis.
Yeah.
But then what you kind of did was and I don't know who threw this idea out there, was to bring in Infinite Crisis, which was set to sort of put some toys back in the box in terms of continuity, in terms of bringing back the Silver
Oh
Age.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, what happened with Supergirl? The Supergirl story is a funny one in a weird way. The Supergirl story is that we had Peter David was having this really interesting run of Supergirl, but at the end of the day, it had nothing to do with Superman or even Supergirl. She was a ex-devil worshipping spirit of angel fire or something like that. It was something very strange, just wearing a Supergirl costume, but nothing of that character tied to the lore of who Supergirl was.
Mhm.
And when you ask people about who Supergirl is, everybody knew her as Kara Zor-El. So the goal for us was to bring Supergirl back to a person or a personality that was the most recognizable version of it. Um,
Mhm.
the Superman Batman book was working extraordinarily well at the start with that. It came out of the gate really strong. And we had just brought Michael Turner over to the company.
Mhm.
And we were looking for a vehicle for Michael. Um, and it took a lot of negotiation inside the building to free up and return Kara Zor-El because it was such an integral part of Crisis on Infinite Earths. They didn't want to lose some of those key aspects because they didn't want to diminish the value of that story, which I understand. But also, I was looking for long-term planning, and I needed a Supergirl that people recognized and played well with the other characters. So ultimately, after a period of time, I was able to bring back Kara Zor-El. I got that approval, and I called up Michael Turner and I told him that his arc would be with Supergirl, and he turned me down at the start. He didn't want to do it. He thought that Supergirl. Michael wasn't a big comic book reader, so he didn't know the value of Supergirl or how big she was in the lore at DC.
Mhm.
So because of that, I was a little crushed, I have to say, and I didn't know what to do. And then Jeff called up Michael, explained to him the whole history of Supergirl and the whole history of Kara Zor-El, and then Michael stepped on, and that book just exploded. Um, which brings us to Infinite Crisis. So there was a whole game plan in place. I had a 5-year plan mapped out of what I was looking to accomplish, including putting it up to a big crossover event down the road. My first attempt at a crossover was going to be a project that Grant Morrison came up with, which is called Crisis in Hypertime. But Hypertime was not a favor of management at the moment, so I put Hypertime on the side, and I told everybody we should just concentrate on making the characters as strong as possible, and that way, when the strong characters had their own strong bases, when we crossed them over, it was the aggregate sum of all these audiences will drive that book through the roof.
Mhm.
But I sat down with Jeff Johns and Greg Rucka and Judd Winnick, and we formulated a plan on how to really um, bring a sense of continuity back to the DC universe again and interactivity, very subtle behind the scenes on to make it feel like it was a shared universe without hitting people over the head. And then ultimately, when you felt that everybody was existing in the same world, then you brought them all together for that one big story that really takes you to the next level, you know?
Yeah. Well, when I think of Infinite Crisis, the thing I think about is, it seems not only to be a very, and I was in college when this book was coming out. I mean, this is like really nostalgic for me. But I remember reading it, loving it. But it seemed to have not only the purpose of being a fun event, but also kind of, again, kind of being with the purpose of restoring things that had been lost. And the number one thing I think had been lost was the history of Wonder Woman, because for whatever reason, um, when management, Giordano or whoever was in charge of these things back in the 80s, when they did the Crisis, after Crisis, they decided to completely erase her history and start her over in quote the modern times. So she was just coming into the stories at that point, and that gutted not only her history but all of DC history, because it destroyed the history of the Justice League. They had to retell that. And that's the one thing I really remember from Infinite Crisis is Alexander Luthor saying in no uncertain terms, this is a new world. We've certain things have been changed. For instance, Wonder Woman was once again a founding member of the Justice League. Was that something that was important to you, or was that more up Jeff's decision, or what how did that?
It was all, these are things that we decided all the way through. We knew that we had to put those things down, and there was a lot of decisions that were made um, for the sake of continuity. And I use this expression all the time about DC Comics. I say it whenever we talk about continuity. Continuity is very hard for DC because ultimately you had Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, who's these true iconic characters at the center that could not change. We tried to change them, but ultimately they had to reset to who they were, while the rest of the characters around them were growing and passing mantles on. So you see this evolution and this progression with all of the DC Universe characters except for Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And because of that, that's what caused the resetting all the time. I had a running joke that wasn't a joke that said that we have to reset the universe every time Dick Grayson is going to be older than Batman because he kept aging and Batman doesn't. So ultimately, as soon as they get close, you sort of reset the line. The problem there is that every time you reset it, you create a new set of characters. That's when you get this aggregate of Kid Flashes and an aggregate of Robins, the aggregate of Wonder Girls. They all start to take on these multiple identities every time they seem to reset. And it just created this log jam of characters that we wanted to clear out and create a lot more, just a consistent universe, an easier to follow universe, and one that really gave the proper respect to the primary characters, which are Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. I was never a fan of post-crisis, I guess, with the idea that Superman wasn't the first hero. I never really glommed onto that. It just didn't seem true to me. It made him feel like he was everyone just like everybody else, and he wasn't. He was far from that. I always felt that he had to be the spark no matter what, and we had to find a way to make those stories so that he was clearly the spark behind the creation of the universe, so to speak. The superhero.
That's Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. We're absolutely on the same page there. I think that's fantastic. And then of course, it was kind of interesting because I always felt like we had so much like I hate to harp on Wonder Woman a little bit more, but like it was like I wanted to see like more about how her rewritten history factored in this new universe. I don't think they ever quite touched on that. But then you only had about 5 years of this new Earth before the
Yeah.
decision was made to just completely reboot everything. And I really like that decision, to be honest with you, because, and you can tell me if this was something that was going on in your head, like you said, when Dick Grayson keeps getting older, when they've gone, characters have been resurrected enough times, when the Joker breaks out of Arkham for the 567th time, it can get a little bit like, why don't we start over and start fresh and have new stories? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, and that was the goal. I mean, the primary goal was sales. No, I won't lie. I mean, the books weren't selling. The at the time the decision was made to do New 52, um, average sales, or I shouldn't even say average sales, that's wrong. Top selling book was at about 60,000 copies, where
Mhm.
prior to that was probably double that number. During the height of the Infinite Crisis, the real hunger, the buzz, 2006, 2007, we were pushing out a lot of books. Then what happened was, and we had a little bit of a fade. Blackest Night came in, gave us a big lift again. It was sort of a nice culmination because characters were killed. But then we went into Brightest Day, and the intriguing thing about Brightest Day was it sort of returned a status quo, but not a status quo anybody really was excited about. It sort of returned characters to a form or a formula that that was familiar, but be honest with you, when those books were being done with those characters, they were canceled. So we're
Mhm.
returning to a formula that ultimately led to cancellations earlier, and yet now making that our backbone. And while we push that forward, the industry just bottomed out.
Mhm.
It's just cratered. So the decision was made, and what happened was that simultaneously at that moment, I was transitioning out of the executive editor role into the co-publisher role with Jim Lee, and Jim and I had taken over the company as publishers. Where executive editor, you were more responsible for the creative direction and creative choices being made. And publishing, you were more in charge of the financial decisions being made and the overall health of the company and staffing of it. So your priorities change along with it, and how you're being judged changes along with it internally within the company. So therefore, we had to make some choices on how we thought was the best way to put out the strongest company possible. And that meant that we needed to reinvent ourselves a little bit and get a fresh start. We had a major change of direction in management. And therefore, because of that, we felt that a fresh start tied to that change seemed to make sense with a new set of eyes, a new sensibility to move the line and the product forward. So, it launched well. Actually, I'm downplaying it. It launched exceptionally well. It was very strong, super start. First 2 years were incredibly successful for us. The problem with everything is the sheer volume of material you're creating, the speed of which you're creating it, and the availability of talent to create it ultimately takes its toll. And there's slippery slopes along the way, and one of the slippery slopes are, making change for the sake of change, rather than thinking it all the way through. At the start of New 52, we had a very clear interpretation of how these characters had to be reinvented and launched. We stuck with that for a while, but once those initial ideas played out, the new ideas that started to replace it weren't as fully thought through and not as well executed, and it became a bit of a mishmash, I used to call it, meaning it's kind of new but not really new. It's sort of the same but not really same. You know what I mean? And because of that, once you didn't have that same level of clarity in the way those characters were presented, um, everybody started to get confused about what exactly what we were trying to accomplish with the launch of the 52, and it sort of lost its way. Plus, a lot of the things that happen along the way too is you're fighting a lot of people who inclination is to do what they remember and what they like and what they grew up on. Nothing wrong with that. But when you're trying to change and grow, um, if everybody comes in new and they just want to do something old, it gets
Mhm.
distracting, and you spend a lot of your energy just trying to get things up to a spot where it's passable rather than exceptional.
Mhm.
And that also hurts the product.
Yeah. So, and I think you were in that position for about 10 years before.
Yeah. I was in the executive editor role for about 7 years. 1 year as VP editorial, which was really my introduction to comics and my introduction to ADC, just navigating and understanding the navigation of the company itself. 7 years with the executive editor role, and then 10 years with the publisher role. Yeah.
Mhm. And I think there's the sources on the internet aren't super clear on everything that's happened in your career since then. I know that right now you're working in this company called Frank Miller Presents, and you are also writing a series for Mad Cave called Defenders of the Universe, which I've got every copy of. So,
Okay. Yeah. No, I actually, Frank Miller Presents has come to an end. Frank and I had gotten together during COVID. We were just kicking around ideas and what to do and basically keep ourselves busy. And I used to visit with him on a pretty regular basis, just check in, see how he's doing. And we kicked off the idea of the company. We launched it. We had a very successful first year. And then the second year, um, it got a little more challenging publishing wise. We tried to expand the line, and Frank's very strong and an independent creator, and felt he was losing some of that independent streak by being a publisher. He sort of became what he was fighting against his entire life. And it started to not be as much fun. And to be honest with you, I'm at that point in my career where I'm doing things that I enjoy more so than anything else. I'm fortunate enough to be able to do that position. And when Frank Miller's End stopped being fun, that's when I decided that, you know, it's better. I'd rather stay friends with Frank than publish,
Mhm.
which is what I'd rather do. And I'm always like finding ways to keep busy and doing the Defender series with Mad Cave. That's something that Mike Martz offered me at a San Diego Comic Con. I found it intriguing. I thought the characters were interesting. I didn't know them all that well, which was great because then I can deep dive into them and learn them, and then come out with that with some ideas along the way, which was fun. And you know, I'm doing things that I find interesting, you know, and I think that's the key to the latter half of your career. You should be hopefully at a point where you can be able to pick and choose what you want to do based upon your own personal interests, and that's kind of what I'm doing right now.
Sounds great. So working for Mad Cave and anything else down the pipeline that you're excited about, or?
Yeah, well, I got a few things. I mean, I was actually trying to get back into animation. I did a number of pitches. Went and met with the Netflix people, a couple of places along the way, just to see what they're looking for and what they're trying to do. Had a couple of projects created, but you know, it's you know, you're always waiting for the right time to bring things out. I did a novel 2 years ago, and I'm due to do a second one, which I'm turning in about a month, which is it's almost done, which is great. So I'm happy about that. And after that, you know, it's really just you know, I've got 5 grandkids, and doing a little travel. Just got back from 2 weeks to Italy, which was spectacular, and I think that keeps you know keeps life interesting, you know.
Fantastic. What is the name of your first novel?
But it was Hide or Seek. It was basically a superhero style novel. It was an idea that I had way back while I was at DC, but never really put it down on paper or anything like that. And once I got out, when COVID hit and we were all stuck in the house, I needed something that was a creative outlet. And I wound up writing the book. It was interesting because I never worked in prose before. I'd done written scripts for animation and comic book scripts naturally,
Mhm.
magazine articles, anything else you know can write, but I never did a novel. And the level of commitment, dedication, focus to be able to do something like that is it's a completely different skill set that I'm used to, and probably not one of my strongest points. So I had some folks come in help me just organize myself because I would be all over the place on that. And It was a learning experience the first one through, and I think hopefully I can improve on it with the next one I work on when I have come out. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of fun.
Fantastic. Well, that brings us up to the present day, and I would encourage folks, if you're watching, go out and get your copy of Hide and Seek. Go buy Defenders of the Earth. Fantastic to be here with you, Mr. Dio, and just thanks for sharing your time with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Ryan. It's a pleasure talking to you.
All right, folks, thank you very much for watching Comic Talk, and we'll catch you next time.